It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative Party Vice Chair Bim Afalami, Shadow Home Office Minister Jess Phillips, academic and author Matt Goodwin and Daily Mirror political editor Pippa Crerar. Today, Boris Johnson has been meeting his cabinet this morning. He says he wants to get on with the job. After this,
I can announce that the Parliamentary Party does have confidence.
Following a day of drama, was it a convincing win or a hollow victory?
The Prime Minister won with 58% of the vote. We've got a working majority of 75, a packed agenda going forward.
I'll make a prediction. We're going to have a new Prime Minister, a new leader of the Conservative Party by party conference this year.
Are two by-elections the next big hazard for the Prime Minister?
He made a few silly mistakes and given himself and the party a bad name.
People want things to be done now, and that's what he's trying to do. So give him a chance.
And after a minister is heckled, does the government need to protect free speech at universities? Well, let's talk about that confidence vote last night. Let's take the temperature with some of the papers and their front pages, starting with The Times. There's Boris Johnson, a wounded victor is their headline. The Mirror has this on the front page, which is the party's over Boris, when it finally comes up. We'll wait just a moment to see if it does. Otherwise, we'll move on to, there it is, parties over Boris, head in hands. We have the Mail front page, which is Boris vows I'll bash on. And finally, the Telegraph. Hollow victory tears Tories apart. And this is how the Prime Minister reacted to the result.
Well, I think this is a very good result for politics and for the country. I do. Just in this sense, I think it's a convincing result, a decisive result, and what it means is that as a government we can move on and focus on the stuff that I think really matters to people.
Good result for politics and for the country, Bim. Is he right?
Well, I'd prefer much prefer that we shouldn't be having these votes at all. The fact that we're having one is clearly not good for the party or the country. I think it's important to be honest about that. But it's also true that, according to our rules, the Prime Minister, and by any fair margin, by any fair assessment, has won by a decent margin. The party now has a choice. I don't buy all the punditry that says we're inexorably doomed to internecine warfare. But the party has a choice now as to how we conduct ourselves. And I think that that's what I and my colleagues will be meditating upon over the coming days, because it is not good for the party, or indeed, more importantly, the country, that we obsess about our own sort of internal battles rather than focusing on governing for the country.
Good result for
and I hope that we can do that.
Well, good result for politics and for the country. Jess, do you agree?
Well, I mean, I'd say it was a good result for the Labour Party, but I'd much rather a better result for the country, because it's much better for me, personally, for me to fight the next general election with Boris Johnson as the leader of the Conservative Party.
Oh, so you were cheering him on?
No, I would much prefer. I didn't expect him to lose the vote yesterday. I don't think anybody did. But I don't think it's particularly good for the country. I don't think it's particularly good for politics, because, actually, even if Boris Johnson had lost yesterday, I imagine he probably would have tried in some way to sort of lurch on, bash on, or whatever it was they said in the Mail. I hate the lack of honour that is being presented as being part of politics. It puts people off. It makes people think that there is no good to be done in politics. And I'm afraid to say Boris Johnson is the absolute figurehead of that. And that makes me pretty sad about the state of our country.
Do you agree with the Prime Minister or with Jess Phillips? Lack of honour?
I certainly think that's an issue in British politics, absolutely. I suppose the question today is it now inevitably the beginning of the end for Boris Johnson? And I was talking to some Red Wall MPs yesterday who you might automatically assume would be sort of Team Johnson. And one of them made an interesting point to me. They said, look, to go out and back for Johnson and ensure that he gets through the year and he gets into the next general election. The problem is we don't feel like we have the policies to do that. So what they want to see, today or tomorrow are big changes on tax, big changes around net zero, some more stuff around, serious stuff around levelling up and all the issues that in 2019, those were the issues that got Johnson this unique coalition. And they're saying, look, it's like going to play cricket and the bat's already broken. They just can't go out and make that case to their constituents. If he can't convince that group of the Conservative Party, then he isn't going to get through the summer.
All right, well, we'll come back to that in just a moment. Go on, Bim.
Well, I mean, look, I don't know who you're speaking to, but I really don't think that's fair. I think that the policy programme that the government's got is broadly supported by a majority of Conservative MPs. You mentioned levelling up. Well, we've done a huge amount around that. We just passed the white paper, and obviously that will get implemented. You mentioned net zero. I think on the environment, polling has shown considerable support for our policies on the environment, support amongst all demographics, all parts of the Conservative coalition. The economy, I think that, again, we need to think about what happens in the budget, but I don't think it's fair to say that we don't have the policy. I think what we now need to do is implement it, show people we're implementing it, and get on with it.
We'll talk about that in a moment, but despite that, the majority of backbench Conservative MPs didn't have confidence in the Prime Minister. Let's just have a look at the numbers, because they are actually quite important. Perhaps you can interpret it for us as to whether it was a good or a bad result in those terms for Boris Johnson. You can see here 59% or 211 for Boris Johnson. They had confidence in Boris Johnson. Most of those will be on the payroll, the government payroll, of course. 148 against, that's 41% of the parliamentary party. How would you interpret it?
Well, it was a bad result. I mean, I was talking to MPs right across the board yesterday, and on the one hand, you had the Prime Minister's allies who were saying privately that they thought if they could keep it under 3 figures, the rebellion, then they were probably going to be OK. And on the other hand, if it was more than 140, the rebellion, then they were in serious trouble. And as we see, the figure was well over that. The key point is that that gives the Prime Minister a majority of 63 MPs that are Tory MPs that are effectively keeping him in Downing Street. If half that number decide, having backed him this time, that he doesn't do the things that Bim mentions, he doesn't deliver on policy, or some of those red wall MPs decide that there's no prospect of him doing that in the 2 years until, or however long it is, until the next general election, then you could well see them deciding that he should go as well, and then he's in a very, very precarious position.
You said you were meditating, or you want you and your colleagues to meditate over
the wise choice of
the
word.
result.
Well, no,
I do. But I mean, you voted for
yes.
and in confidence for the Prime Minister. How strong is that confidence, or is it not very firm?
Well, the point I was trying to make is that we have a choice now. We've had this result. As I say, I wouldn't start from here, but that's where we are. Now we have a choice whether we go into internal warfare or we work together to deliver the policies and the sort of debates that we were having, that Matthew and I were talking about earlier.
But you're not delirious about Boris Johnson's leadership?
No, but look, it is mad for anybody to be in the position where you think that if you are in a place where numbers of letters have gone in and there's this sort of vote, that anybody thinks that's a good place for us to be. But this is not the end. We need to work together to move forward, because divided parties not only don't win elections, but they don't govern the country well. And that's what we've really got to be able to do.
Should Boris Johnson lead the Conservative Party in the next general election?
Well, that's the decision of the party, and that's what we've decided today. But at the same time, what we've got to do is we've got to get on with doing all the things that we're saying we're doing and deliver on those policies. Because if we don't do that, then it doesn't really matter who the Prime Minister is. We're not going to do well at the next election unless we deliver for the people that put us here. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Jess, it is precarious, depending on your perspective, but you will remember an overwhelming number of Labour MPs voted no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn. I'm sure you do. Back in 2016, and yet he won the leadership election and went on to fight 2 more general elections. So, like Jeremy Corbyn, do you think Boris Johnson can also survive?
Oh, 100%, because we are in a different era of politics, actually, where that sort of lurching on, regardless of whether you have the support of... and actually, it shouldn't undermine the support of members of Parliament, because admittedly it's like 300-odd people and there's millions of people in the country. But we have a parliamentary democracy, and that does matter. But, yeah, I mean, I can totally see... I actually think that there are similarities in their approaches and, in fact, the sort of portion of support that they get from their own parties is not dissimilar either.
Jo, could I just point one thing out, which I do feel like this conversation about Boris Johnson, it's very Westminster, right? It's very MPs, it's very focused on Parliament.
Because, of course, it's the outcome of a Westminster vote.
Sure. But it's important to remember yesterday there was a poll by YouGov asking people what they felt should happen at that vote. And of the 2019 Conservative voters, most of them said they wanted Johnson to stay. Now, it was about 58, 59%. It was close, but a majority said they wanted him to stay. I don't think that voice actually has really come through in this debate so far. They're clearly on a knife edge. They're clearly losing a lot of patience with the Prime Minister. But that comes back to this point about policy. And the only point I'd go back to Ben briefly on is we have a massive state. We have the highest tax burden since the 1950s. And we have lots of Conservative MPs saying, this isn't what I signed up to in 2019. That is the core problem for a third of the Conservative Party.
I don't think you can pin it all on one poll, though, as well, because there were others yesterday, including, it's not just MPs, including the Conservative Home MP of Conservative members which said that the vast majority, or rather the majority is 55%, thought that the Prime Minister, the MPs should boot the Prime Minister out, and an opinion poll of all voters, all the electorate, saying that it also thought that he should go. Now, that's not 2019. That's not 2019 Conservative voters, but it does include, of course, those seats like BIMS across the South East, the so-called blue wall, where MPs are starting to feel a bit anxious about the rise of the Lib Dems. And we have, in 2 weeks' time, whatever it is, two key by-elections, one in the red wall seat of Wakefield and one in the south-west seat of Tiverton, which are going to be possibly, because we're all expecting defeat, certainly, I think, in Wakefield. I think we'll see how it goes in Tiverton. But they're not looking good for the Conservatives, so possibly it's priced in a bit. But it still will be, I think, a symbolic moment that will have MPs like BIM and Tory MPs across the south actually feeling a bit jittery about electoral prospects. And
we'll ask him. I'm going to ask you about that in just a moment, because I want to pick up with one Conservative MP who voted no confidence in the Prime Minister. He's John Barron. He's here in our Westminster studio. Hello to you, John.
Hi, good afternoon.
The Prime Minister says the result is very good, as we were just discussing. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree, unfortunately. But can I bring us back to the issue of honour and integrity? Because I think that's very important. There is a sort of view that the rebels, so to speak, are a homogenous group. That's not true. The electoral cycle wanes and so forth, and that is the natural course of politics. But for a lot of party members, actually, and a lot of colleagues in the House, what is important is the integrity of Parliament. And for many of us, the Sue Gray report laid bare the extent of rule breaking, and therefore the repeated assurances by the Prime Minister in the House that he was not aware of any rule breaking is simply not credible. So I would just caution this business about by-elections and so forth, because for a lot of us it's about the principle of the integrity of Parliament, maintaining the credibility. If we cannot trust what politicians tell us at the dispatch box, then we're on a very slippery slope.
So in your mind, does the Prime Minister have a mandate now to fight the next election?
Well, yes, in the sense that he's been a massive majority at the last election. The rules say he stays in, at least for a year. I can only say it as I see it, and for me the integrity of Parliament is paramount. But, taking in the round, what I will be doing over the course of the next period is trying to do my bit, taking each vote accordingly and looking at it individually, but overall trying to deliver on our manifesto, which I hope will include lower taxes, more support for the vulnerable and disadvantaged, and better enjoying the Brexit freedoms that we now have.
Right. You mentioned the rules, John Barron. They mean currently that the Prime Minister can't be challenged for a year. Would you like to see those rules changed? I've spoken to a couple of Conservative MPs who are very keen for that to happen, for it to be reduced and shortened to 6 months, so Boris Johnson could be challenged later this year. In order to protect the integrity of Parliament, would you support that?
Well, I think that's up to the 1922 committee. I mean, the danger with changing the rules at a time like this, it was similar to the whole issue with, the Owen Paterson affair, where we conflated the changing the rules with the individual case. I think we've got to tread carefully here. I mean, my instinct is that we can only speak up as we see it. And when you worry about the Prime Minister basically telling the truth at the dispatch box, then, you have to act accordingly and not necessarily be part of a plot and whether that includes or not changing the rules in the 1922 committee.
Right, and as you said, it's not a homogenous group. In fact, we on the programme have been talking about the fact that the MPs criticising the Prime Minister came from pretty well every wing of the Conservative Party. But there has been a suggestion from some quite senior MPs who support Boris Johnson, saying that actually it was a group of Remainers, mainly Remainers, who moved against him. How do you feel about that?
Well, you will well know I voted for Brexit. I'm very proud of that, and we're beginning to see many of the benefits of Brexit, including record low unemployment and reasonable growth, and many treaties as well. So it's not true that. I'm sorry.
Anyway.
For me, as I said, it's about whether people can trust what is being said at the dispatch box, but also people's perception of Parliament at a time when there is a bit of cynicism out there about politicians. The behaviour in recent months over the course of the last year at the dispatch box has not been good for the country, has not instilled faith in Parliament, and we've got to put that right.
Thanks very much, John Barron. Pippa, where does this go next? If you are one of those MPs who voted against Boris Johnson, what are the options?
Well, I think they will also be reflecting in the days to come, just as MPs who supported him will be, as to what the best course of action will be. And certainly some of those I've spoken to this morning are absolutely adamant that now, particularly if they hadn't previously put their heads above the parapet, and they now have, that they will be continuing in this course, that they don't intend to ease pressure on the Prime Minister, and that they still think that he should go even though they lost this vote. The issue, though, of course, is that there will be others who decide that, well, they're going to accept the result of the vote, even if they don't like, even if they don't like it. And there isn't, as we know, a coordinated plot. There are individual groups of MPs, some who are working together, some who are working independently. Many of them with their own issues, their own reasons for wanting to bring Boris Johnson down.
Do you think the rules will change, that it will go from a year to 6 months before Boris Johnson could be challenged again? Or do you think there's any sense of cabinet ministers resigning?
Well, what we know is that the rules are very opaque, and that there has been indications from Tory grandees that they could, the executive committee of the 1922 committee could, if they wanted to, reduce that time frame from a year to 6 months or even 3 months. But what we don't know, beyond the belief that it would require a majority of Conservative MPs wanting that to happen, how they would actually judge what that majority of MPs was, whether it would mean maybe not 54 letters, but a number of letters from the majority of the party, or whether there were sort of public moments like, for example, the by-elections, which might trigger another vote. That is absolutely unclear. And I think whether we see cabinet resignations or not, I think it's going to be crucial in the next few days. I think we might see ministerial resignations, and that's certainly been the rumour around Westminster. And if we start to see a few ministers going, then, who knows what happens next?
Well, let's just take this headline from William Hague, former party leader, in The Times. Boris Johnson should look for an honourable exit. Last night's revolt makes the Prime Minister's position unsustainable. He must spare his party and the country further agonies. Now, he's not just any old Conservative, is he, Bim?
No, he's not. And I know William and respect him very much. And I know and respect John Barron as well. I think that what is important now for all of us in the Conservative Party is we have to not just come together, because that's all easier said than done. It is to focus on the things that we agree upon, which is the vast majority of our policy platform. One thing Matthew said earlier, which I wanted to come back to him on, was he talked about the state being very big.
Well, and John Barron said the same. He wanted to see a different sort of tax policy.
I couldn't agree more. I agree. I completely agree. We need to change that. In the budget in the autumn, I think colleagues are going to be looking to the Chancellor to really show a clearer direction in a more liberal economic fashion. And they're the sort of things that I know the party broadly can agree with. And that's what we need to focus on. We know what we're implementing. We agree on the vast majority of it. Let's get on with it, do it. And then hopefully, with time, we can rebuild that trust and connection with the electorate.
Jess?
I think that Boris Johnson has totally missed the opportunity for a honourable exit. He missed it about 6 months ago, and the idea that he's even capable of an honourable exit, I think, is for the birds. But it's charming of William Hague to suggest otherwise. I think that the truth is that we keep talking about these policy platforms that are going to help and the shrinking of the state. I'm not entirely sure how exactly the enormous problems with our economy and the cost of living crisis, which is affecting not just the poorest, but every single household in the entire country, and levelling up, I'm afraid to say, as somebody who lives in an area that's meant to be levelled up, is just a two-word slogan for, like, putting, like, a leisure centre in Stoke. Unless people actually start to feel that there is a future that they can look forward to. The trouble for Boris Johnson that I see when I knock doors or around the country in various by-elections, as well as where I come from, which is a Leave voting seat, the trouble is he's a busted flush. It doesn't matter what he says and promises, there is a fundamental belief system problem that he now has. To get over, how is he going to get over that? And so William Hague is right, exit, albeit not very honourable, is the answer.
Jim?
Well, I disagree with much of what Jess said, but I do agree with her in this one instance, where Jess was talking about the need for us to show people how their lives are going to be different, whether that be through levelling up in areas like yours, whether it be through in different areas of policy.
Mate. I mean, 10
whether
years
it be through
of degradation.
whether it be through improvements we need to make the economy, all of those things, showing people, and not just people like me talking about it, is absolutely essential. And on that, I can agree with Jess, though not on the rest.
Just one thing to come back to Pippa's point about the rule change. I do think it's also worth remembering we've just gone through a very turbulent decade in British politics that's included things we hadn't had before.
We had past tense.
We're still going through. Populism,
it's not easing up.
Brexit, different Conservative electorate. Like, it was just, it still is, but it was very chaotic. If the rules are changed to remove Boris Johnson, there will be a significant number of voters who will see that as a stitch-up. A lot of people that came out in 2019 to vote for Johnson who thought they were getting this new changing of the zeitgeist in Britain. They thought they were going to get a Prime Minister who was going to deliver Brexit, level up, take on institutions, reform civil service, NHS, all that sort of stuff. There is a risk in this if it goes that way in the summer, I do think, which is that a lot of those voters either withdraw from politics and say, well, he won a leadership election, they still got rid of him, he won a confidence vote. Or we have something darker and more ugly on the right of the Conservative Party, which moves in to try and hoover up those voters. And all I'm saying is I just think actually we need to tread quite carefully over the next 6 months. And Johnson's won this vote. And if we start changing rules and moving things around just to get him out, I think voters will respond to that.
Johnson would never do that, would he? He'd never think of changing rules to protect himself and the other people.
I'm not making a case for Johnson. I'm just saying the history of the last 10 years, I think there will be consequences to those kinds of decisions.
What I agree with Matt is that I think that there is an issue with engagement in politics. What I think the bigger issue, though, for Boris Johnson is that he was elected in part because of all the promises he made. And yes, there's been turbulent times with the pandemic and so on. But if those voters that sometimes voted for the Conservatives for the first time, sometimes voted for the first time,
that's definitely the case.
To retain that sort of engagement with the political process, which I think we'd all agree we want them to do, they have to feel that those promises have been delivered on, or at least on track, and they don't feel it right now. And 2 years, or possibly sooner, if the threats of the whips are to be believed, until the next general election, is not much time to deliver some of those major infrastructure changes, generational shifts that things like levelling up require. He overpromised so far. Some of the reasons, we understand why he's under-delivered, and the time is running out. The clock is ticking, and it's not just about people in communities like Jess's that are requiring levelling up to improve their area. It's also the people that voted for him in the expectation that there would be major change. And if it isn't delivered, lack of delivery, I think, is going to be his biggest problem going forward.
Can I just show you this? BBC Politics. It's a tweet about Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky saying he's very happy Boris Johnson remains in post as Prime Minister. I'm glad, he says, we haven't lost an important ally. This is great news, he says. Is that a significant intervention? What do you make of that, Jess?
I mean, I'm not surprised that a man who who is facing a dreadful and deadly war in his land wishes to keep his allies close. But the idea that anyone who replaced Boris Johnson wouldn't do exactly what Boris Johnson has done in Ukraine, I mean, it's a sort of dreadful thing, isn't it, to suggest that if Jeremy Hunt were to replace him, suddenly he'd ally himself with Putin. But Boris Johnson will sweat any assets. You know, there are people being raped and abused and murdered in Ukraine. I think they've probably got bigger fish to fry than what 148 Conservative MPs think.
What do you think, Bim? Wouldn't any leader be the same in terms of support for Ukraine?
Well, in broad terms, I'm confident that anybody who led the Conservative Party in broadly would be supportive of Ukraine. But it's not just about the broad terms, it's about the individual decisions that you make. And I think the particular decision by Ben Wallace and the Prime Minister to send arms to Ukraine much earlier than almost any other country was doing so was of real significance. That is not necessarily just an automatic given. And I just use that as one example of something which I think the Prime Minister, regardless of, you know, and I think colleagues who may have even voted against him yesterday would recognise, you know, he's done very, very well on that and continues to do so.
But of course, Ben Wallace tops the Conservative members' own polls consistently as being the favourite to succeed Boris Johnson. So, you know, there you go. Maybe he could take over and continue that.
Well, let's talk about the two by-elections that you mentioned earlier, Pippa. These are contests both taking place on June the 23rd, following the resignation of two Conservative MPs. They resigned in some disgrace. They're in Wakefield and in Tiverton and Honiton. With me are Martin Oates, political editor of BBC South West, and Gemma Dillon, political reporter for BBC Yorkshire. First of all, Martin, what's happening in Tiverton and Honiton?
Well, on paper, this is a very safe Tory seat, huge majority, rural constituency, but we're seeing the Lib Dems paying a huge amount of attention to it. So we've had Ed Davey, Lib Dem leader, down twice. I think he's back again this week, a slew of Lib Dem frontbenchers. Now, on the face of it, you might think that's a bit odd because at the last election they came a poor third behind Labour's poor second, but they'll be looking back 20 years to a time when they came pretty close to taking it, at a time, of course, when they took a lot of Tory seats in the rural southwest and held them with big majorities. Now, we are seeing Tory big beasts, Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, Jacob Rees-Mogg, but rather oddly, those visits don't seem to have been flagged to the media, or at least to the BBC, in advance. The Lib Dem press machine, very assiduous in flagging those things. Now, if the Lib Dems took the seat or came close to taking it, that could be very significant, because remember, back in 2015, David Cameron's very slim majority was largely credited for the Tories' success in wiping out all of those Lib Dem MPs in the southwest. Now, if they got to a position of being able to nip at the Tories' heels again here, at the same time, of course, you'll be hearing more about this in a minute, as they run into potential difficulties in those new seats in the north of England that they took at the last elections, that could cause real difficulties for them.
Right, well, I'm just going to show everybody the full list of candidates for that Tiverton and Honiton by-election. You can see it there. Any more information on the BBC website. Thank you very much to you, Martin Oates there. Let's talk to Gemma in Wakefield. Gemma, what's the situation there?
Well, again, I think it's really interesting up here. Wakefield, of course, selected a Conservative MP for the first time in 2019 for almost 100 years. So how things are playing out with voters, very interesting. Some voters, Partygate has really cut through. They'll tell you that they believe the Prime Minister broke the rules and he lied about it. And if he lied about that, can they trust him with the levelling up agenda to fulfil those promises? Other voters look at you, they sort of shrug and say, well, loads of people broke the rules. All he did was have a drink at work. Let's give him another chance. And they'll also point to Brexit. Don't forget, Wakefield was one of the big cities in Yorkshire that backed Brexit. So the fact that it's done, that really resonates with people up here as well. When it comes to campaigning, Labour have a huge presence out on the streets. We hear a lot about shadow cabinet ministers coming up, Lisa Nandy, Wes Streeting, campaigning on the streets. The Conservatives say they are too. They are sending MPs up as well. Rishi Sunak was here last week in a voluntary capacity. They're getting on with the job. They're knocking on the doors and finding out what people think.
Gemma Dillon, thank you very much there in Wakefield. I'm going to show the expansive list of candidates who are standing in the Wakefield by-election. You can see them all there. Probably not time to read them all, so if you want to do some more research, do go to the BBC website. Thank you to both of my colleagues who have given us the latest on the by-elections that are coming up at the end of the month. Matt, thinking about Wakefield and similar constituencies, which the Conservatives won in the 2019 general election, is Boris Johnson really the only Conservative leader who can successfully reach those parts of the UK, or was it, as one MP suggested yesterday, much more about a rejection of Jeremy Corbyn in that last election?
No, it wasn't just a rejection of Corbyn at all. Boris Johnson is the only Conservative so far that we have who has actually won as many of those seats as we saw in 2019. So his potential successors are unknown quantities. When you look at people like Ben Wallace or Nadine Zahawi or Liz Truss, etc., we just don't know yet how they do in those seats. If he loses Wakefield heavily, which the polling suggests he will do, I agree with Pippa. On the one hand, that's sort of priced in now. We're expecting these losses, but it will undermine his claim to be able to hold those seats, which again will add to pressure on him. It is worth remembering, though, to be the counter voice in this debate, perhaps again, go back to Margaret Thatcher in 79 to 83, 83 to 87. Labour and the Liberals routinely smashed Thatcher at by-elections, all the way through, sometimes with a 24-point swing in some of them. So, yes, this is all important, but let's also kind of keep perspective when we interpret what happens at these.
All right, do you think, Pippa, anyone else, when you're talking, you mentioned Ben Wallace, could be successful in red wall areas?
We just don't know. I mean, I agree with Matt that at the last election, Boris Johnson was clearly a huge factor, but also Brexit and Jeremy Corbyn were. And of those three factors, which in my mind are the main three which won him the scale of the majority that he won, were two of those are no longer sort of in play. Certainly not in a major way. And it's very difficult to work out how much of the support in the red wall for Boris Johnson was of that moment and how much of it would stay despite everything that's happened in the meantime. Issues like immigration, for example, which were really sort of top of the agenda for many voters over the last sort of 5-10 years, in some ways have been, if not entirely neutralised, but have become less significant as a result of Brexit, and people feeling, whether it's true or not, that the government, the UK now has more control over its own borders. So, there's lots of issues which were big then, which aren't necessarily going to be this time round. And I think, as ever, we all sort of talk about Boris Johnson as being the Heineken politician that reaches parts that other politicians can't. You can never put too much emphasis on one person in politics. It's just not the way it works.
Do you think he is still the Heineken politician in that sense, in those areas which Labour held for generations and were won for the first time by Conservatives?
No. I don't think he is. I think he's probably still has an element of charm about him that people, and he's a positive character, and I genuinely don't think that should be underestimated. However, I mean, I went outdoor knocking in Wakefield the other day, and
we should be careful about talking about the by-elections.
I apologise. No. Okay. I mean, obviously there are many candidates, people. I mean, it felt to me like people were really, really, really cross at him and didn't want their vote to be used as a medal for him, and that was really concerning to them. But it wasn't that they'd gone off conservatism, they'd gone off Boris Johnson. Yes.
Well, then let's talk about the blue wall, because that is the other phrase used to describe seats like yours in the south of England. Bim, I will let you come back if you want to come back specifically, but that is also a problem for some of your colleagues who may have voted against Boris Johnson because they fear he is no longer an electoral asset in those areas. You've got a 7,000 majority in your seat, Hitchin and Harpenden. The Lib Dems came second in the 2019 election with just under 21,000 votes to your 28,000. You must be feeling a little nervous.
So look, I think that whether people talk about red wall or blue wall, there are a couple of things that I think get routinely misinterpreted. The first is the term, which was termed by James Canagasorian, was about areas that demographically and attitudinally would have been Conservative seats if they're in most other parts of the country, in terms of the Red Wall. So what he was saying was these were areas that should have been Conservative, and what had happened through a bunch of political changes, some of the things Matthew was talking about earlier, Brexit being a key one, meant that these were places that then started to behave like the rest of the country. So that's the first point. The second, in relation to the so-called Blue Wall, a lot of research on this and experience anecdotally and empirically will show that what people want in Hertfordshire or Surrey or Oxfordshire is not a million miles different from what they want in Yorkshire or Newcastle or County Durham.
But it's who can deliver it.
And delivery is key, and I won't repeat on the importance of that. But it's really, really important that we do not allow the sort of punditry and newspaper world to try and slice and dice our country and assume that in order for the Conservative Party, or indeed the Labour Party, to be successful, it needs to somehow offer completely different things in different parts of the country. We are one country, and in order to be successful in governing this country for the interests of people in this country, you need to think of it as a country and know that people care about their schools and their hospitals in Yorkshire and Hertfordshire just the same.
And those broad principles, absolutely. But do you agree with that you can't be a political party that's offering different things to different parts of the country? How else do you appeal to places that really are quite different, apart from, yes, broad support for good schools, good hospitals and safe areas?
Well, I am instinctively wary of Blue Wall versus Red Wall talk, but the reality is the Conservatives over the last 7 years have been making ground among working class voters, non-graduate, non-degree holding voters and Britain's pensioners, but losing ground among university degree holders, middle-class professionals, young voters like my students in Canterbury, especially young women, and black and minority ethnic voters. So when you look at where those voters are concentrated, that helps to explain why the Conservatives now are being chased out of London, university towns and parts of the southeast commuter belt. So the only way forward for Johnson or whoever succeeds him at the next election or whoever's running the party, leading the party, my personal view is they're going to have to offset losses in those typically more southern areas while trying to somehow expand their gains in areas where there are more workers, non-graduates and pensioners. That's basically the only way forward for the Conservative Party at the next election.
And for the Labour Party?
Look, I actually agree with Bim. I think that, and the rhetoric around the Labour Party, whether it's Red Wall, Blue Wall, it gets to be about liberal metropolitan elites who live in cities. Well, if you lived in the bit of the city that I represent, you wouldn't be describing it as liberal metropolitan elite. It's, for example, nowhere near the university town. The vast majority of people won't have degrees.
So I imagine also very diverse as well.
It is quite diverse, although less diverse than other bits of Birmingham. So yeah, and also when we talk about working class people, we must make sure that we are including a diversity of working class people, because working class people aren't all one thing at all. But the reality is that I genuinely think that if you have a hopeful vision of the future, that people believe you can actually deliver. The people in Bolton and the people in Brighton want the same thing. They dream the same dream. They want the same thing, in the words of Belinda Carlisle, I believe. We'll see what they want
very
in Carlisle.
Profound from Belinda Carlisle. Let's have a look at this in the Mail on Sunday. The far-left mob can yell Tory scum at me all they like, but free speech has to win. This is written by the Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, days after he was hounded off a university campus by trans activists. Just let's have a look at some of that. It was So, LGBT plus protesters at the University of Warwick, as I say, shouting Tory scum as Nadeem Zahawi arrived to address the Conservative Association. He did actually give that talk. Is this not just a typical student protest, Matt? It isn't new.
No, I think on one hand it isn't new, but I do think we have a problem with universities. I've come on this programme before saying that I think the Higher Education Academic Freedom Bill, which is coming back before Parliament on June the 13th, is needed. This wasn't actually just a peaceful protest. There was some punches and physical confrontation as well with young Conservative activists being targeted. We've had the Kathleen Stott case recently. We've had the Noel Carl case, the Jordan Peterson case, the Neil Thin case, the Joe Phoenix case. I could go on and on. And so what I'm hopeful with this legislation that's coming forward is actually simply by trying to promote the free speech, freedom of views, freedom for academics like me to explore what we want, to say what we want. We're already beginning to see universities change their policies in response to that. The University of Essex this week has changed their policy. My university is revising its academic freedom policy, which is wonderful because it wants to be a leader in academic freedom. And so, yeah, actually, I think Nadeem Zahawi's piece was spot on. We've got a problem.
Right. Do you agree there's a problem, or do you think this is really the same as time immemorial at university campuses? Because the Education Secretary concluded that from that experience, Nadeem Zahawi, to quote him, said, the chilling crushing of free speech needs to be countered. Do you agree?
Well, when I was at university, at the University of Leeds, I was in the same year and in some of the same classes as the youth leader of the BNP, and we had a whole debate in our student union about whether he should be able to speak, and a lovely young Asian lad stood up and said, you know what, let him speak, he'll make basically a fool of himself. He made a speech about pasta. Nobody thought of him again. I mean, unfortunately, I read in the Times yesterday that same person has, the Times reported, had links with National Action. So, you know, you have to be careful. But the only person who was banned from my student university union, and there was a plaque outside banning him, and this was 22 years ago, so this is not new, was Jack Straw. So Jack Straw was banned from my university union. I don't remember there being a massive uproar about that at the time. I don't think that you can sue your way. University students should be allowed to, and university teachers should be allowed to invite whoever they want to come and speak. And also, they should be able to protest. What Nadeem Zahawi faced there, I have faced hundreds of times protests when I've been at things. But the reality is that why aren't the government focusing on issues? Why have we got this piece of legislation? For example, you sat there and named a few people. I couldn't sit. There isn't enough time on this programme for me to sit and name all the people who've been silenced by universities when they've been sexually abused on campus and have been made to sign non-disclosure agreements. But the government are doing absolutely nothing about that.
Matt, and then I'll come to you.
Well, if we look at the evidence that we've got about sort of what is happening across the country, the UCU, which is a main union for academics like me, their report suggests that 1 in 3 of Britain's academics are what we call self-censoring. They're hiding their views on campus because they feel like they can't express them. And King's College London have done a report last year. They found that 1/4 of all university students in the country say
How will this bill change that?
Say they're self-censoring.
How will that change
Because
it?
what's happening in universities, what I've observed working in universities for 20 years, is unfortunately some universities have become highly political organisations where it's quite clear that certain social and political norms are at work that leave people who don't share that particular ideology or view. It leaves them feeling as though they can't express their opinion and their views. And it also means that
I'm in spaces all the time where people don't agree with my ideology, and I have to try and push on through. It's dreadful if people feel like that. They shouldn't feel like that. But being able for somebody to be able to sue a university
let me give you
in order to speak there, let's say a horrible anti-Semite, being able to sue a university because their students didn't want them to be there. I don't know what the benefit of that is.
I'll give you a real-world case.
I've got hundreds of non-disclosure cases.
Presumably, you would feel that Kathleen Stott losing her job at the University of Sussex.
Well, hang on, because we haven't got time to talk about one specific
case. Dreadful, but she left her job, and the university supported.
If we had this legislation, if we had this legislation at that point in time,
how would it have changed?
Academics like Kathleen and many others who are being harassed on campus would be able to go to the Director of Academic Freedom, an office that would oversee those individual cases. We don't have that protection currently.
All right. Well, is this worse? We haven't got them.
Why are we drawing this false comparison?
Hang on.
It's about freedom of speech. But a non-disclosure literally stops your
very briefly, Bim, is this any different or any worse to what it was like when Jess was at university?
I think it is worse insofar as I think it's more vicious, what you see on university campuses now, than at least when I was at university. I don't know when Jess was, when Jess was at university.
I'm 40 years old.
It feels a little more vicious and worse, and we need to stamp it out.
Pippa, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to get a word in on this. You may not be
silenced.
disappointed. You've been silenced. Yes, you have been silenced by me. That's all we have time for today. Thank you very much to all of my guests, and I'll be back for Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow at 11:15 with Politics Live. Bye-bye.